Welcome to MOOC Introduction to Sociology Part 2. Today our topic will be feminist movement in international perspective and from the perspective of India as well. Now when we talk about feminist movements all over the world, what do we aim at? We aim at prolonged and sustained development or upgradation of women in the society. From what condition? From the present condition. But that needs a proper structure, and the needs of goals and roles need to be set for that reason. In India, women's movement started long after it began in the world. It began in 1975, and along with the world, it is continuing till the present time. So, as to say, women's movement aimed towards development in what ways? Policy-oriented development and legislation-oriented development of the women so that it remained in a sustainable condition. Now, we'll move on to the waves of feminism that began in the international sphere. First wave, to give a brief overview, in 1830, the main issues that rose to the women's movement were very right-based, and the primary conditions were to abolish slavery and to give women equal rights to vote. So that was the legislative right that the women demanded in the first wave of the feminist movement. In 1848, Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1920, after the 19th Amendment, women were guaranteed their right to vote. Now, that was a long fight. Now, in the second wave, feminist consciousness heightened to another level, and very precisely the period was 1966 to 1979. It was linked to civil rights, which was the key issue, and women demanded anti-discriminatory politics and equal privileges to whom? To the men counterpart. Now the third wave, it compels the society to think beyond the heterosexual boundary and to think beyond the incomprehensive society. So it aims towards a very inclusive and comprehensive society. Now, to say about the first wave of feminist movement, how did it begin? Now, that started with the Enlightenment Doctrine of Human Rights as it is written in the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789, which was during the French Revolution. So what did it talk about? It talked about rights of political voting, ownership of property, inheritance, education, and work for women in the public sector. It focused on the rights to vote, the right to work, which were only for so long reserved for the men, quote unquote, where men were thought to be the rational beings of the society. The eminent thinkers of first wave feminism who brought this thought process of feminist movement or feminist upheaval, right? Okay, so the first person was John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, whose work was the foundation stone for women's right-based movement. And the seminal work that we're talking about is The Subjection of Women, written in 1869, that focused on the women's right to vote, and also it undermined the popular stereotypes of women that were used to justify women's political exclusion. And what are the popular stereotypes that we're talking about? We're talking about the stereotyping of women as infantile, as irrational beings. That means it contradicted on women being irrational and infantile. So he said that women were beings of rational, they had the power to think, they had the power to deliver, and they had the power to work as well, which is equivalent to the men. So they should be given the right to vote and the right to work. Next, move on to another seminal work which is a marker of the first wave of the feminist movement, a book written by Harriet Taylor initially, and then various essays by John Stuart Mill were included in it, and the work is named as The Enfranchisement of Women in 1851. So it also talked about the essentiality of political involvement of women, and also it was the first book to talk about the women's right to sue a divorce against a man in case a marriage or a commitment bonding does not work. Next, we move on to the second wave of feminist movement. Now, feminist movement started to become a little bit more nuanced, and little bit more focus was laid on women's liberation. Women's liberation from what? Women's liberation was focused more on public and private sphere. Now, what is public and private sphere? Private sphere is our household structure, the family, the kinship. These are the private, where the life is very private. And now what is public sphere? The workspace, the governmental space, or the space that we go out beyond the private life. So liberation was felt in that sphere. Now, the feminists of this period demanded liberation, but they did not challenge the structure of the society. They accepted the patriarchal norms, but worked within them and demanded and made their demands. Next, we move on to after the 1990s, we move on to the contemporary period, where strong push was required to break this normative society, and that began the third wave of feminism. Third wave feminism was a time of post-structuralist movement where views on gender and sexuality were challenged. And they also challenged the second wave's policing norms and stereotypical societal structure. Now we go on to the theoretical perspectives of the movement. Firstly, what we said is how the feminist movement can be divided into waves. Now we are moving on to the theoretical perspectives of the movement. It can be divided into liberal feminism, socialist feminism, Marxist feminism, radical feminism, and to a more advancement will be queer theory, then black feminism, ecofeminism. So these are the things that is moving on. We are slowly moving on, or the feminist movement is slowly moving on. Now we talk about liberal feminism. What is liberal feminism? Liberal feminism believed that societal notions are the origin of gender differences. It aimed towards gender justice and majorly focused on right-based movements. If we can tally the liberal feminism with the wave, we will be seeing that it gets into both the first and the second wave of the feminist movement. The thinkers, John Stuart Mill, Mary Wollstonecraft, Harriet Taylor, we already talked about them in the first wave feminist thinkers, right? Now we are moving on to Marxist feminism. They think that class is the important thing that ascribes women's status and functions in the society. So, class plays an important role in ascribing the women's status and function in the society. Second, it says that private property is the basis of monogamous marriage, which means that monogamous marriage happens only because private property, the idea of private property is there. And it also says that family is the microcosm or the smaller version of class relations in the society. So how do we define all these things? Let me begin from the end. Now, when we are talking about family, we are talking about a normal family which has got a functional husband, a wife, or a man and a woman, and the children. Now, the man is the bread earner, so he will be the bourgeoisie, and the woman is the labor class, and the children are just the byproducts of that labor. So, private property is the basis of monogamous marriage. So, we can think it in two ways. That is, private property, marriage is sort of, as the Marxist feminists believed, though it may sound bizarre now, but monogamous marriage also gives an idea of private property. And also monogamous marriage, it deals with the passage of property rights. So, this is what the Marxist feminists thought about. Next, we move on to the socialist feminism. Socialist feminism is the synthesis of Marxist and radical feminism. They believe that women are oppressed because of their dependence on the male counterpart. They're talking about economic dependence or uneven distribution of wealth. Therefore, liberation from economic dependence can only liberate women. That is what the socialist feminists thought about. They thought that only social and economic justice can liberate women from their oppressed status. Now, we move on to the radical feminists. It said that male power is the basis of social relations. So, if we have to liberate women from their oppressed status, we have to abolish the male supremacy. And how that male supremacy can be abolished? By concentrating on women-centric beliefs and systems which should emphasize on the benefits of women. Next is the multiracial feminism or black feminism, which talks about the intersections of race, class, and gender, and the importance is only given on human agency. We can see the movement or the protest. This black feminism is also about anti-racism campaigns. Next, we are moving on to postmodern feminism. Postmodern feminism, what does it talk about? It talks about categorizing women rather than universalizing them. It emphasizes on the experiences of women and the individualistic experiences of women. It does not take women as a collective. And it says that there are differences of women on the basis of class, race, and likewise. It separates issues of color women, women from third world countries, lesbian women, non-binary women, and likewise. Next, we are moving on to queer theory, or the movement that is based on queer theory, which says that sexual identities are results of social constructs and it is performed, and via that performance, that type of idea of sexual identity is formed, and there are meanings that are associated with such sexual identities, which is commonly accepted by the society as gender norms. Next is cultural feminism, which says that there are fundamental differences between women and men, and such needs to be celebrated. That is, there is no need to feel shy, or there is no need to shy off from those differences, and that needs to be celebrated. It also supports and nurtures, this is very interesting, the works of women that are lost or marginalized to recreate cultures and recover traditions. This can easily go into the example of how nowadays handwork done by women all over the world is being celebrated. Now we are moving on to women's movement in India, and we will start a little bit from the ancient time and we'll move on to the present. Okay, so first let us discuss what was the status of women in India during the ancient period. It is very known to us that during the Vedic period, women had very high and very celebrated status. They were considered the lighthouse of the universe. Men and women were thought to be equal. Then women were celebrated as Shakti, or the female creative energy, and there were religious scriptures and mythology that talks about such. So, in the later Vedic period, what happened is slowly and gradually the position of women started degrading. And the role and importance of women depended on her advancement in life cycle. Firstly, the role of daughter, then of wife, then of mother, and then as time progressed, the role and importance of women, of the specific women or the women class in the family changed gradually. So this was a very common practice during the later Vedic period. They lost their independence, they became more dependent on the menfolk. A very notable thing happened, that is, they were denied the right to education, which was very much celebrated during the Vedic period. We know the names of many literate women of the Vedic period, very well known women of the Vedic period, who were mathematicians, and then they were philosophers, they were thinkers, and so on. And then patriarchal society slowly started to take its form during the start of the later Vedic period. What happened in the medieval time? In the medieval time, Islamic invasion happened, and there was this slow encroachment or slow adaptation of Islamic customs, and somehow that influenced the women's dependence on men. Parda system started, dowry, child marriage, sati pratha, devdasi, it all started as a result of, when it's not very specific to just because Islamic invasion happened, but any time of the history, any such invasion happens on the prevalent society, the society counteracts its effects on the women folk. This is true for throughout the world history. Now, society, it started to turn orthodox and oppressive towards women. Now, we move on to the colonial era, where there is slowly the advancement of the Britishers, and the Muslim era started to slowly finish off, and wars were a very common scenario during that time. But women participated in the warfare, and they learned warfare techniques. Rajputs are very prime example of people of India who taught their women folk the techniques of warfare. Now, it is also true that there were Britishers who led to many reformist movements in India against the oppressions that were prevalent during the Muslim period, and Lord Bentinck was one of them. Now, many women organizations were also set up during the period which wanted to act towards the betterment of the women. Next, we move on to independent India. Movement or feminist movement in India cannot be categorized into waves or theories, but it started in a very radical form. And that radical or sudden marker of feminist movement is a very, very intrinsic character of feminist movement in India. Now, let's go back to the status of women in independent India. What happened was, firstly, they were guaranteed constitutional equality. What do we mean by constitutional equality? We mean that they were given equal rights that were written in the Constitution of India. So it was declared right. Women's development was also given equivalent importance to national development. And articles like Article 14 and 15 were constituted that provided legal equality to women and prohibited any kind of discrimination or atrocity on the basis of gender. And then in 1961, Dowry Prohibition Act was formed, and other acts were also formed to protect women from societal oppressions. Therefore, what we can say is there were acts and there were rights and there were legal reforms that made its way in India's feminist movement. But there was something other than these constitutional rights or acts or rights, whatever, which caused women's movement to uproar, that gave its radical character. There were multiple dowry deaths, there were rapes in police custodies, there was underrepresentation of women in public spheres, there was unequal wages to work, differential sex ratio, and concerning low age of girls in marriage. So there were various reasons or various, you may say, inequalities that resulted in the feminist or rise in the feminist movement in India. So this is one image that we can see where women are seen protesting against rape, which resulted in the formation of Article 14 and 15. Now, women's movement in India after independence or from independence. After independence, by 1970, the political atmosphere started to change for women in India. That means they, as I said earlier also, they were given constitutional rights, and slowly there were representation of women seen in the political sphere. Many organizations started to work and started to exist towards the cause of development of women in India. Socio-economic, cultural and political changes started to form slowly. Next, we are moving on to contemporary India. In 1991, India adopted globalization of the economic sector, or economic liberalization happened in India, which opened up the gates of India towards the foreign countries, and there was a massive cultural shift. This cultural shift pointed out to the questions of women's freedom of choice, desires, and such questions were raised. Before this contemporary India, what was happening? Women's movement were challenging against atrocities that are happening towards women. But after independence or after 1991, what was, as we have said earlier also, at some point of time in the society, feminist movements have become or turned out to be more nuanced. Now we are challenging the choices or the freedom that is not given to the women. So before this, we were challenging the rights, and the rights that were not available to the women, to the atrocities that were happening to the women, and now we are challenging the rights and choices that are not made available for the women. So from here, we are saying that a nuanced form of feminist movement is happening. Now, let us focus on the movements that started to begin from 21st century. In 2003, Blank Noise Project began against eve teasing. In 2011, Slut Walk against victim blaming. In 2017, Bake Off Azadi, which spoke of freedom from gender equality and sexual violence. Then the Me Too movement that began in 1997 in the international sphere, and in 2018 in India it became prominent. Then Stop Acid Sale movement in 2005, Lahu Ka Lagan movement in 2017, which was a seminal movement against the 12% GST that was charged on sanitary napkins. Then the Nirbhaya movement, which aimed towards women's freedom irrespective of time, clothes, culture, sexual orientation, which forced the government to expand its legal definition of rape and harsher punishment on rapists, voyeurists, and likewise. Now, other movements or notable issues that we can talk about are the Gulabo Gang, who protests and protects women against domestic violence and has its ownership to radical feminist perspective, and the Chipko Andolan that happened in 1973, where women and men activists both played equal important role lighting up the eco-feminist trait of thought in India. Now here we can see an image of the Gulabo Gang, and by the image it is very evidently seen that it is are very radical in nature. This is all we come to know about the feminist movements in India. And as it is seen or felt, feminist movements is not an it's not it has not ended. It is moving on towards new genres. So that will be all.